It's interesting. I wrote a talk. Here's the talk, and I am going to use it a little bit. But last night I was sitting in bed and thinking, wow, what has happened in all this time? And there it is, Chapin Hall, just the same as it always was. Williams was one of these places that can change and be the same, just the same. And I can tell you it'll always be a place where you can come and have peace as you drive into those hills. My convocation, I was sitting there in your seat. And my parents were sitting about way back, and they got captured in a picture that was taken. And I have that picture of them proudly looking on at that ceremony. Who knew that all these years later, from 1963 to 2019, that I would get a chance to come back here to the same place and to see my dear wife sitting there in that seat. And she's part of this talk, and so I wanted to introduce you to her, to see her there. And my daughter, who is sitting somewhere in here. I don't know, where are you, Marilyn? There you are. Marilyn, my two granddaughters, and my son-in-law, who made the trek up here to be with me today. It's a very, very emotional moment, I can tell you that. But I do want to teach you some neurology, because that's what I do. I teach neurology. Just over a half century ago, in the mid-1950s, at the height of our paranoia as a country about communists and the Soviet Union, a boy, probably 8 years old, sees a flying saucer land in the distance. No one else sees this event. The occupants of this mysterious aircraft proved to be invaders from Mars. Of course, symbolically, they were the Russians that we were so afraid of, and they had landed there. And of course, they were always evil figures, never positive figures. Their strategy was to capture people one by one and to suck them underground into their laboratory, where they would perform brain surgery on them, whereby an electrode controlling device was placed in the victim's brain, which rendered them pawns of the invaders, although they retained the identical superficial appearance of a human being. You couldn't tell by looking at them. The only clue to recognizing one of these unfortunate robots was to look at the base of the neck, at the nape of the neck, where they had done their surgery. And you could see at the hairline that something had been injected into the brain. Maybe we should take a moment and look at each other's. Look at the one next to you. You'll see in a minute why I say that. You say, well, I don't have one of these things in my neck. In order to understand the profound meaning of the invaders from Mars, you have to know a little neurology. There are really two people within each of us, a fact that reflects the two almost mirror cerebral images, cerebral hemispheres, each responsible for the opposite side of the body and extrapersonal space. Put simply, damage to the left hemisphere will cause paralysis of the and loss of sensation of the right side of the body, including loss of perception from the right side of the world, if you could imagine such an event. This loss of perception is more profound than simple blindness. It reflects the fact that anything the brain does not recognize is actually not there. We live, after all, in virtual reality. What our brains do not sense is, for us, not there. I'm going to do the following experiment with you. We're going to do 2 experiments together. I hope you'll participate. Let me ask you, what is behind your head? Don't turn your head. What is behind your head? Not what you imagine is behind your head, or what you remember might have been behind your head. What is actually there? Is it green? Is it white? Is it striped? Try to describe it in words. You don't have the words, do you? Because what there is nothing behind your head. It has no color, it has no texture, it has no shape. You couldn't possibly know, could you? Its fine characteristics. Though the 2 cerebral hemispheres are roughly symmetrical, there's one striking difference. Do you know what that is? The neuroscience folks in the audience. How many of you here consider yourself right-handers? Can you just raise your hand? That's 93%. How many of you, listen carefully, are not right-handers? Can you raise your hand? And here's an odd question. How many of you are consider yourself left-handers? Notice there's 3 kinds of people, aren't there? There's right-handers, 93%. There's non-right-handers, and then there's the others. Note that not all people who are not right-handed are left-handed. For almost all of you right-handers and many of you non-right-handers, only the left hemisphere has the circuitry for language. Not speech, language, the code we use to communicate with one another. Eons ago, the pressures of evolution selected those of our ancestors who could communicate with each other, an enormous advantage for social animals like ourselves. The massive amount of computing capacity needed for language could not be duplicated in both hemispheres. The head, already too large for the body, notice the curve in my neck from having to hold my head, which is too big for the spine. It's simply not large enough so a compromise occurred. Language would only be represented in one hemisphere, while other important functions related to attention would be represented in the analogous structure in the other hemisphere. Language could have gone either way eons ago, but by chance alone, it happened that it went leftward. All of you right-handers have left hemisphere dominance for language. That's 93% of you. Even some of you non-right-handers who are not left-handers, you know who you are, may have dominant language in the left hemisphere, as we've learned from modern imaging techniques. Only you true left-handers, that small group that we saw at the end, are the throwbacks to our primitive ancestors. As you can see, you're almost extinct. When we talk to somebody, we're only talking to the left hemisphere person, because that is the hemisphere with language. When I say to somebody, "How are you?" they really respond, "We are fine." I am fine, my left hemisphere. And I hear through connections from the other side that my good friend who shares the same skull is also all right. We are fine. Thanks for asking. In 1971, that was just after my graduation from Williams College. I was in medical school. I was graduating from the University of Cincinnati Medical School, and I was asked by my classmates to speak to my medical school at the graduation ceremony, something like this. But they had a specific idea in mind. They wanted me to tell the faculty about the antennae in the back of their necks. We students could see them, the antennae in the back of the neck. Though talented, dedicated, hardworking, and well-meaning, many of the faculty had over the years gradually been captured by the invaders from Mars. And they didn't know that they had an antenna in the base of their neck, because by definition they can't see it. It's nowhere. My message that day was based on a quotation by somebody who should be very familiar to you. It was James A. Garfield, a Clevelander as I am, who was our only president of the United States, our Williams College president of the United States, a minister. And this is what he said to Mark Hopkins, the great educator. "I'm not willing that this discussion should close without mention of the value of a true teacher. Give me a log hut with only a simple bench, Mark Hopkins on one end and I on the other, and you can have all the buildings, apparatus, and libraries without him." That's very much been true for me as I've seen beautiful equipment built up around me, which has added something, but is overrated. On that day, over 50 years ago, I argued that our medical education was marked by rote learning, by unnecessary repetition, by lack of integration. We basically did forced labor for a period of 4 years. I placed the blame entirely on the faculty, representatives of which sat sullen-faced behind me as I delivered this 30-minute screed on behalf of my class. This does not happen here, and you notice they're not sullen-faced at all, and shouldn't be. My words were met in some quarters with anger and resentment, disappointment and disbelief. One of the faculty members wrote me a letter and said, "You've underlined the futility of attempting the transmission of ideals to unready minds." It's my clear recollection, bolstered by an opportunity to reread your text, that under the guise of the philosopher, that you exhibited malice, pettiness, and poor taste. That's pretty strong. What did he mean? By the way, I did ask some people, what should I talk to them about? There's a 2-generation gap. What do they want to hear about? And there was one answer that came back multiple times: short. So thank you very much. But let me, in all seriousness, finish in less than 5 minutes. When some of our friends and allies told us that they didn't believe there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Do you remember that? Did you remember reading about it anyway? We discounted them as cowardly, insular, weak, naive, and short-sighted. Do you remember that happening? Up to and including the president. But they were trying to be our best friends. Only they could see the antennae in the back of our necks. The problem, of course, was what we call anosognosia, denial of deficit, because the lesion is in the non-language hemisphere, and we don't have any way to express what we are seeing or feeling or hearing there. One of the most maddening responses that I get when I voice disagreement, I'll bet you can really relate to this. With a powerful force, somebody senior to you, they say to me, "You don't seem to get it." That makes me angry. And I respond by saying, "You're wrong. I do get it. I just don't agree with you." That's different, isn't it? There's a new kind of language. I'm not going to read you my entire piece. You can read it on a blog if you want to. An entire language of management that tells you for sure the person has an antenna at the base of their neck. Here's a sentence. See if you recognize it. "I'm afraid if we don't drill down on our brand equity on the front end, we'll have to model it out on the back end and align our incentives or pad our ask regarding the co-branding deliverables on the horizon." Look it up and read the entire thing and see if you hear it. If you hear that from anybody, you are hearing it from somebody who's been taken over. It's a business culture talking. There's nothing wrong with the business culture. It just isn't our culture, is it? Our culture is the culture of the mind, and that's the way we should talk to each other. I loved my education. It gave me the opportunity to live my dream of reducing suffering. When I told our medical faculty about the electrodes in the back of their neck, I thought I was performing the most valued function of a good friend. However, what I did not and could not have known is that I also had fallen prey to the invaders from Mars. It's easy to forget that oneself is not susceptible to the same errors and problems as you heard I have an interest. In speaking for my class, we had become consumed by our victim role. I was unaware of the effect these words would have when delivered in the context of what was to be a happy and celebratory event. I was too narcissistic to know that. To finish, I take you back to Robbie Burns. Sitting in church one day in 1785, the great Scot poet, Robert Burns, noticed a head louse climbing up the neck and onto the hat of an elegant lady seated in front of him. He says to himself, "Ha, where are you going, you crawling furly? Your impudence protects you sorely. I cannot say, but ye strut rarely over gauze and lace. Though faith, I fear, you dine but sparely on such a place. You ugly, creepin', blastin' wonder, detested, shunned by saint and sinner? How dare you sit upon her, such a fine lady? Go somewhere else and seek your dinner on some poor body. He goes on to describe the critter impudently climbing right to the top of her stylish hat. She, of course, arrogantly never imagined that such a lowlife could be standing right on the top of her head. That's because she had anosognosia. Unlike what most of us would do, Burns had the courage to turn directly to this woman. And he said, "Oh, Jenny, do not toss your head and set your beauties all abread. You little ken and cursed spread the blasted making. The winks and finger ends, I dread, are notice taken." He's done it, hasn't he? He has performed the most valued and rare duty of a real friend. And he and I conclude, first in Scottish, "O wad some power the gift he gie us to see ourselves as others see us. It would from many a blunder free us and foolish notion." The side point, think of our country, think of our land. What airs and dress and gait would leave us, and even devotion. Once more and finally in English, American English. Oh, would some God the gift to give us to see ourselves as others see us. It would from many a blunder free us and foolish notion. What airs and dress and gait would leave us, and even devotion. Thank you.